The greatest debts are never written in contracts. They are written in the hearts of those who remember. The federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan has never sounded this quiet. Hundreds of people fill the polished oak benches, yet no one dares to whisper as 12 jurors stare toward the defense table where Vincent Moretti sits with his hands folded, his silver hair neatly combed, his charcoal suit perfectly pressed despite the weight of the moment. For more than 30 years, newspapers have called him the last great Mafia boss in America. Rivals feared him. Politicians denied knowing him. Business leaders pretended they had never shared his table. Now, under the pale morning light spilling through the towering courtroom windows, none of those titles matter anymore. Today, he is simply an aging man waiting for a verdict that could erase everything he spent a lifetime building. His face remains calm, but his tired blue eyes drift toward the empty doorway every few seconds, as though he is still expecting someone who will never come. Around him, former associates avoid eye contact. Some have already accepted immunity deals. Others quietly changed loyalties months ago. The empire that once stretched across neighborhoods, shipping companies, restaurants, construction firms, and generations of family traditions has begun collapsing long before this trial ever reached its final day. Outside, television crews crowd the courthouse steps beneath rows of satellite trucks while reporters rehearse the headlines they are certain they will deliver before sunset. Everyone believes this story is already over. The prosecutors certainly do. They organize thick binders filled with years of financial records and sworn testimony. The spectators believe it too. Some came hoping to witness history. Others came hoping to watch a legend finally fall. Even the court officers carry themselves with the quiet confidence of people expecting an ordinary conclusion to an extraordinary case. Only Vincent seems strangely patient. He glances once toward the old wristwatch he has worn for nearly 2 decades before closing his eyes for a single steady breath. It is not fear resting behind those weathered features. It is faith. Somewhere beyond those courtroom doors, footsteps echo against polished marble floors. Slow, measured, unhurried. The heavy doors swing open, and every conversation dies before another word can be spoken. A young black woman enters carrying nothing but a worn leather briefcase and a stack of neatly organized legal files. Her navy suit is simple. Her posture is confident. Her expression reveals neither anger nor pride, only quiet determination. She walks past rows of reporters who suddenly stop typing. She passes attorneys who exchange puzzled looks because no one recognizes her name on the appearance sheet. Without hesitation, she approaches the defense table. Vincent lifts his eyes. For the first time in decades, the man once known for never showing emotion cannot hide the tears gathering beneath his lashes. His lips tremble almost imperceptibly as he whispers 3 words that no microphone is close enough to capture. You came back. The young attorney smiles with the warmth of someone returning home after a very long journey, places her briefcase on the table, and gently replies, I told you 15 years ago that one day I would repay everything. The memory arrives before the verdict ever can. 15 years earlier, New York had worn one of those bitter January nights that turned every breath into a cloud of silver. The sidewalks shimmered beneath old streetlights, and a steady wind swept through narrow alleys carrying the scent of roasted chestnuts from distant food carts and the faint rumble of traffic that never truly slept. Vincent Moretti had dismissed his driver 2 blocks earlier, choosing to walk alone as he often did when the weight of business became heavier than the city itself. His tailored overcoat shielded him from the cold, but nothing protected him from the silence that had settled into his life after years of success had left him surrounded by people who respected his influence more than they cared for the man beneath it. As he passed a small neighborhood church preparing to close its doors for the evening, something caught his attention. Not a voice, not movement, just a pair of eyes watching from beside. A stack of worn cardboard boxes beneath the shelter of an old loading dock. A little girl, no older than 10, wrapped herself inside an oversized gray hoodie several sizes too large. Her shoes were cracked along the soles, and her small hands were tucked beneath her arms in a determined effort to stay warm. She did not ask for money. She did not cry for help. She simply watched people hurry past, as though she had already learned the painful lesson that invisible children were rarely noticed. Vincent slowed his pace. The girl looked away first, expecting him to continue walking like everyone else. Instead, he quietly removed his leather gloves and knelt until they were nearly at eye level. "Have you eaten today?" he asked. She hesitated before giving the smallest shake of her head. "Yesterday." Another pause. Again, she shook her head. There was no self-pity in her expression, only exhaustion beyond her years. Vincent looked toward the brightly lit diner across the street before extending his hand. "Come with me." The girl did not move. She studied his face with remarkable caution, measuring every word against every disappointment life had already given her. "Why?" she whispered. The question settled between them more heavily than the winter air. Vincent smiled gently, though sadness lingered behind his blue eyes. "Because nobody should have to face this weather alone." She finally stood, her movements slow and uncertain, never taking her eyes off him. Inside the diner, the warmth wrapped around them like a forgotten memory. Fresh coffee filled the air. Pancakes sizzled on the grill. A waitress quietly placed a bowl of chicken soup, warm bread, and hot chocolate in front of the little girl without asking questions after recognizing Vincent. The child stared at the meal for several seconds as though she could not believe it belonged to her. "You should eat before it gets cold," Vincent said softly. She reached for the spoon with trembling fingers, but stopped once more. Looking directly at him, she asked the question that would remain in his heart for the next 15 years. "If I stay, do I finally get to have a name that somebody remembers?" Vincent looked at the little girl for a long moment before answering. Outside, snow drifted past the restaurant windows while the city hurried on without noticing that two strangers had just reached a crossroads neither of them could have imagined. "Everyone deserves to have a name remembered," he said quietly. "What is yours?" The girl lowered her eyes toward the steaming bowl of soup. "Naomi," she answered almost in a whisper, as though saying it too loudly might cause it to disappear. Vincent repeated it with gentle certainty. "Naomi." She smiled for the first time, a small uncertain smile that transformed her tired face. It was not because of the food waiting in front of her. It was because someone had spoken her name as if it mattered. That single moment became the beginning of a story that would reshape both of their lives. The next morning, Vincent brought Naomi to his estate on the outskirts of Westchester County. The sprawling stone mansion stood behind tall iron gates, surrounded by bare oak trees resting through winter. Staff members exchanged puzzled glances as they watched the little girl step carefully across polished marble floors, clutching the backpack that held everything she owned. Word spread quickly through the household. By evening, several of Vincent's most trusted advisors had gathered in his private study. Among them stood Anthony Russo, his longtime consigliere, whose calm voice often carried more influence than anyone realized. Anthony folded his hands before speaking carefully. "Vincent, people are already asking questions. This is not wise." Another advisor nodded. "She is a stranger. You do not know where she came from or who might be looking for her." A third added with polite restraint, "There are charities. There are foster programs. You do not need to involve yourself personally." Vincent listened without interrupting. When every opinion had finally been spoken, he rose from behind his desk and walked toward the window overlooking the snow-covered gardens. "Every one of you has spent years asking me to protect what we have built," he said. "Tell me, what exactly have we built if we cannot protect one hungry child?" Silence filled the room. No one offered another argument. They understood the conversation was over. Over the following weeks, Naomi slowly adjusted to a life she had never imagined. She received warm clothes that actually fit, books chosen for her age, and a quiet bedroom with a window overlooking the frozen gardens. Yet the greatest gift was not comfort. It was stability. Every evening at exactly 6 o'clock, Vincent joined her for dinner, no matter how busy his schedule became. They talked about school, history, music, and the changing seasons. He never spoke about his business. He never asked her to earn her place. One evening, Naomi looked across the table and asked, "Are you teaching me to become like you?" Vincent smiled gently before shaking his head. "No, Naomi. I am hoping you become someone much better than I ever was." Those words settled deep within her heart, unnoticed by everyone except the man who quietly believed that true legacies were never measured by power or wealth, but by the lives forever changed through simple acts of mercy. The years passed quietly, not because life became easy, but because purpose slowly replaced survival. Spring returned to the gardens of the Moretti estate again and again, each season carrying Naomi a little farther from the frightened child who had once counted every meal as a miracle. She grew into a thoughtful young woman with calm eyes that noticed details most people ignored. Her teachers praised her curiosity. Her neighbors admired her kindness. Yet the whispers never disappeared completely. Some people insisted she had only been fortunate enough to cross paths with a wealthy benefactor. Others assumed she would eventually inherit influence she had never earned. Vincent heard every rumor, but he never answered a single one. Instead, he answered with discipline. Every Saturday morning, while many people his age enjoyed leisurely breakfasts, Vincent drove Naomi through New York City without security escorts or expensive displays of status. They visited public libraries, museums, community centers, and courthouses. He encouraged her to ask questions about everything she saw. Power fades, he often told her while they climbed the wide marble steps of the courthouse in Manhattan. Knowledge stays with you long after every title disappears. Naomi remembered every word. When she entered high school, she developed a fascination with constitutional law and the American justice system. She spent evenings reading landmark court decisions while other students filled their schedules with social events. Vincent occasionally found her asleep beside stacks of law books with a lamp still glowing softly over the desk. Rather than waking her immediately, he quietly placed a blanket across her shoulders before turning off the light. One autumn afternoon, as golden leaves drifted across the estate, Naomi returned home carrying the acceptance letter she had dreamed about for years. She had earned admission to one of the nation's most respected law schools through academic excellence and scholarships. Her hands trembled as she handed the envelope to Vincent. He read it slowly, then looked at her with unmistakable pride. "You did this," he said, "not because of me, because you refused to let your past decide your future." Naomi smiled, but her expression quickly became serious. "People will always connect my name to yours." Vincent folded the letter carefully and returned it to her. "Then spend your life giving them a better reason to remember it." Unknown to nearly everyone around them, he quietly arranged one final lesson before she left for college. He introduced Naomi to retired federal judge Eleanor Whitmore, a woman whose integrity had earned respect across every political line. Judge Whitmore agreed to mentor the young student on one condition: she earns every opportunity herself. Vincent accepted without hesitation. Over the next several years, Naomi built her reputation through relentless work rather than family influence. She graduated near the top of her class, completed prestigious judicial clerkships, and became known for preparing every case with extraordinary precision. Few colleagues ever asked about her childhood because she rarely spoke of it. Fewer still knew that the quiet gentleman who occasionally attended her graduation ceremonies or sat anonymously in the back row during important milestones was the same man whose name filled newspaper headlines. Vincent had never wanted to build someone who depended on his empire. He had spent 15 years quietly building the one person who could stand above it. Success has a way of making hidden cracks easier to ignore until the entire foundation begins to shift. 15 years after that winter evening, Vincent Moretti no longer measured his days by business meetings or public headlines. His mornings began with black coffee on the terrace overlooking the quiet gardens, where the same oak trees had grown taller alongside Naomi. Age had softened the sharp edges of his face, adding silver to his hair and deeper lines around thoughtful blue eyes. But his routine remained remarkably steady. Every Friday afternoon, without exception, Naomi called him from wherever her work had taken her. Sometimes the conversation lasted 20 minutes, sometimes only 2. They rarely discussed legal cases. Instead, they spoke about books, neighborhood restaurants, the changing weather, and whether the roses in the garden had started blooming again. Those simple conversations had become more valuable to Vincent than any business victory he had ever celebrated. Yet beyond the gates of the estate, the world was changing far faster than either of them realized. Federal investigators had quietly spent years assembling financial records, corporate filings, property transfers, and testimony connected to people who had once worked within Vincent's vast network of companies. Most of those businesses operated legally, employing thousands of ordinary Americans who had no connection to old rumors or whispered stories from decades earlier. But appearances carried enormous weight, and the investigation expanded until nearly every major decision Vincent had ever made was viewed through the darkest possible lens. Even more troubling, trusted allies slowly began disappearing from his side. Some retired unexpectedly. Others accepted offers elsewhere. A few simply stopped returning calls. Anthony Russo, the advisor who had stood beside Vincent for more than 25 years, remained outwardly loyal. He attended every strategy meeting, reassured nervous executives, and insisted the organization would weather another difficult season just as it always had. His calm confidence comforted nearly everyone except Vincent. Experience had taught him that people often spoke most gently when they were hiding the loudest truths. One rainy evening, Vincent stood alone in his study listening to drops tap softly against the tall windows. He opened a leather folder containing several recent reports and noticed inconsistencies that seemed too precise to be accidental. Important documents had been copied without authorization. Confidential schedules had somehow reached outside parties. Private meetings had become public knowledge within hours. None of it proved betrayal, yet together they formed a pattern impossible to ignore. Anthony entered carrying fresh coffee, smiling with the familiar ease of an old friend. "Long day?" he asked. Vincent accepted the cup, but kept his eyes on the papers spread across the desk. "Long enough to remind me that time changes everyone." Anthony laughed quietly. "Not everyone." Vincent finally looked up. "That is exactly what worries me." Neither man said another word. The silence lingered long after Anthony left the room. Later that night, Vincent walked through the quiet halls of the estate until he reached the library, where Naomi had once spent countless evenings studying beneath warm lamps and towering shelves of law books. Her favorite chair still stood beside the fireplace exactly where she had left it years earlier. Resting one hand against its worn leather, Vincent whispered into the empty room, "I hope I prepared you for the day I could no longer protect you, because I have a feeling that day has finally arrived." The investigation moved with the quiet confidence of a tide that had been rising for years. Federal agents arrived with neatly organized boxes of documents, financial summaries, sworn statements, and carefully constructed timelines that seemed impossible to challenge at first glance. News channels replayed the same images from dawn until midnight. Commentators spoke as though the final chapter had already been written. Across New York, people debated Vincent Moretti's future in restaurants, barbershops, office break rooms, and subway platforms, each conversation adding another layer to a story that had grown larger than the man himself. Through it all, Vincent remained remarkably composed. He answered every lawful request, attended every scheduled hearing, and never allowed frustration to replace dignity. Still, each passing day carried another quiet loss. Longtime business partners withdrew from shared projects. Charitable organizations returned donations to avoid unwanted attention. Invitations stopped arriving. The empire he had spent decades transforming into legitimate enterprises seemed to fade a little more with every sunrise. Anthony Russo continued standing beside him in public, offering reassuring words whenever cameras appeared. "We only need patience," he repeated during strategy meetings. "The truth always finds its way." Vincent nodded politely, but something inside him had changed. Trust, once broken by even the smallest crack, rarely returned to its original shape. Then came the morning of the final hearing. The courthouse stood beneath a pale gray sky while television crews gathered behind metal barricades lining the sidewalk. Reporters adjusted microphones as spectators formed long lines hoping to witness a historic conclusion. Inside the courtroom, every seat filled long before the judge entered. Attorneys reviewed their notes one last time. Court officers quietly directed people into place. Vincent sat alone at the defense table, his silver watch resting against the polished wood exactly as it had every day throughout the proceedings. He looked older than when the trial had begun, but not defeated. His eyes drifted once again toward the entrance. The lead prosecutor rose confidently, believing the final presentation would end months of preparation with a decisive victory. The courtroom settled into complete silence. Even the air seemed to pause. Then the heavy doors opened. A young black attorney stepped inside, carrying a weathered leather briefcase that had clearly traveled through years of careful use rather than display. Her navy suit was elegant without seeking attention. Her stride was calm, measured, and unwavering. No cameras flashed at first because very few people recognized her. She approached the clerk's desk, presented her credentials, and quietly signed her appearance. The clerk looked up with visible surprise before passing the paperwork to the judge. A murmur spread across the room as attorneys searched their files for a name they had not expected to see. Naomi Brooks walked directly toward the defense table without looking left or right. Vincent slowly stood as she stopped beside him. For a brief moment, the courtroom disappeared around them. 15 years collapsed into a single heartbeat. He searched her face and found the same determined eyes that had once looked at him across a bowl of hot soup on a freezing winter night. Naomi offered a gentle smile before placing one reassuring hand on the table. "You once told me that knowledge stays long after power disappears," she said softly. "Today, I finally understand why you wanted me to remember those words." Naomi waited until every eye in the courtroom settled upon her before speaking. She did not raise her voice. She did not rely on dramatic gestures. Years of disciplined preparation had taught her that truth rarely needed to shout. "Your Honor," she began, "this case has been built upon thousands of pages of financial records, witness testimony, and digital correspondence. My responsibility today is not to question the dedication of the investigation. My responsibility is to question whether every conclusion drawn from that evidence is complete." The courtroom became perfectly still. Even the reporters lowered their pens. Naomi opened her weathered briefcase and carefully removed several neatly organized binders, each marked with colored tabs and handwritten notes. She approached the evidence screen and displayed a timeline that stretched across several years. At first glance, it looked nearly identical to the prosecution's own presentation. Then she highlighted several transactions that had occurred only minutes apart on different continents, using identical authorization credentials. These approvals could not have been personally completed by the same individual, she explained. They required simultaneous access from separate locations. Quiet murmurs spread across the gallery. Naomi continued calmly, revealing travel records, security logs, archived email metadata, and corporate access reports that had never been examined together as one continuous sequence. Individually, each document appeared ordinary. Together, they revealed a pattern that no longer fit the narrative everyone had accepted. Vincent remained silent, watching not with surprise, but with quiet admiration. He recognized the method immediately. She was doing exactly what he had encouraged throughout her education. Never stop after finding the first answer. Keep searching until every piece belongs to the same truth. Naomi turned toward the judge once again. "There is one additional fact this court deserves to consider." She requested permission to introduce a previously overlooked corporate authorization ledger that had only recently been authenticated through independent forensic review. The judge examined the filing before granting permission. Naomi placed the enlarged document onto the display. One signature appeared repeatedly beside critical financial decisions. It was not Vincent's. It belonged to Anthony Russo. The room fell silent once more. Anthony's composed expression changed almost imperceptibly as he leaned forward in his seat. Naomi never looked toward him. Instead, she continued presenting the evidence with the same measured confidence. For more than 2 decades, Mr. Russo possessed independent authority to approve operational decisions across numerous companies. These records demonstrate that several actions attributed solely to Mr. Moretti were, in fact, executed under delegated authority that has not previously been distinguished during these proceedings. No accusation left her lips. No dramatic claim interrupted the dignity of the courtroom. She simply connected documents that had always existed but had never been viewed together. The prosecutor requested a brief recess to review the newly organized material. The judge agreed. As attorneys quietly gathered around stacks of evidence, the atmosphere inside the courtroom shifted completely. What had seemed like an inevitable conclusion only an hour earlier was now filled with uncertainty. Vincent looked toward Naomi with the same gentle pride he had shown when she first learned to read beside the library fireplace. She noticed his expression and offered the smallest reassuring smile before whispering words only he could hear. "You gave a frightened little girl a future. Today, I am simply returning something that has always belonged to you. A fair chance to let the truth be heard." When the court reconvened, the atmosphere no longer carried the certainty that had filled the room only an hour earlier. Attorneys who had entered with absolute confidence now whispered over stacks of documents, comparing timelines, signatures, and access records that suddenly refused to fit together. Reporters refreshed their notes, realizing the story they had prepared overnight was quietly slipping away from them. The judge adjusted his glasses and carefully reviewed the newly submitted evidence before looking toward both legal teams. "The court is interested only in facts," he said evenly. "If additional verified information exists, it deserves the same careful consideration as every exhibit already admitted." Naomi rose once again, her voice calm and steady. She called an independent forensic accounting specialist whose credentials had been accepted by both parties months before the trial had even begun. The expert explained, step by step, how authorization systems within large corporate structures often allowed delegated executives to approve major financial actions without the owner's direct involvement. Complex diagrams appeared on the courtroom screens, showing chains of approvals that had remained hidden beneath thousands of ordinary business transactions. Piece by piece, the image became clearer. Several critical decisions previously attributed directly to Vincent had actually passed through multiple administrative layers before receiving final execution. Naomi did not argue that every decision made over the years had been perfect. Instead, she demonstrated that the legal responsibility assigned within this particular case required a far more precise examination than broad assumptions allowed. The courtroom listened with complete attention. Even those who had expected to witness the closing chapter of a powerful man's life now leaned forward, searching for details they had overlooked. Anthony Russo remained composed, but the confidence that had once surrounded him seemed noticeably diminished. For the first time since the proceedings began, his eyes rarely left the evidence displayed before him. Vincent observed everything in silence. He had spent decades believing leadership meant carrying every burden himself. Watching Naomi separate emotion from evidence with such patience, he understood that true strength sometimes appeared not through authority, but through restraint. Late that afternoon, after reviewing the expanded record, the judge returned with a measured ruling. Several central allegations would require further examination before any final judgment could be entered because the newly organized evidence raised significant questions regarding responsibility and decision-making. The request for immediate judgment was denied. The courtroom released a collective breath almost at once. It was not a declaration that every question had been answered, nor did it erase the years of investigation that had brought everyone there. It simply restored something that had nearly disappeared during the long months of public speculation: fairness. As people slowly filed out into the marble hallway, television crews hurried outside to rewrite their headlines for the evening broadcasts. Vincent remained seated for a quiet moment, looking toward the empty witness stand before turning to Naomi. "You did not rescue my reputation," he said softly. "You rescued the truth from being buried beneath assumptions." Naomi closed her briefcase and smiled with quiet humility. "You once taught me that every person deserves to be judged by what can actually be proven, not by what others expect to believe. I only returned the lesson to the man who first believed that a forgotten little girl deserved the same chance." Several months later, the first warm days of spring settled gently across New York, replacing the cold gray skies that had watched over so many uncertain mornings. The legal process continued exactly as the court required, guided by evidence rather than assumptions, while Vincent Moretti quietly stepped away from the life that had once defined his name. One by one, the companies that had survived decades of economic change were placed under transparent professional management, independent oversight, and charitable partnerships designed to serve the communities where they had long operated. Thousands of employees kept their jobs. Local businesses continued opening their doors every morning. Families who depended on those paychecks never noticed how much had changed behind the scenes because Vincent had decided that the greatest legacy was not holding power forever, but making certain ordinary people never paid the price for someone else's mistakes. Reporters continued requesting interviews, yet he politely declined each invitation. He no longer wished to defend his past. He preferred investing in someone else's future. Naomi visited the estate every Sunday afternoon, just as she had promised years before. The grand house felt quieter now. Fewer meetings filled the library. Fewer expensive cars arrived at the front gate. Instead, the gardens echoed with birds returning after winter, and fresh flowers lined the stone paths where silence had once carried the weight of complicated decisions. One evening, as the sun settled behind the tall oak trees, Vincent and Naomi sat together on the old wooden bench overlooking the roses that had finally begun to bloom again. Neither of them spoke for several peaceful minutes. The breeze carried the familiar scent of fresh grass and distant rain, reminding Vincent of another season long ago when one simple question had changed everything. He looked toward Naomi with the same gentle expression she remembered from the diner on that freezing January night. "The day I found you," he said quietly, "I believed I was saving a child who had been forgotten by the world." Naomi smiled softly, her eyes reflecting the golden light of the evening. She reached into her briefcase and carefully unfolded a worn piece of paper that had traveled with her for 15 years. It was the original scholarship acceptance letter Vincent had encouraged her to earn on her own. She had kept it not because of the school, but because his handwritten note remained folded inside. The ink had faded slightly with time, but the words were still clear. "Never let your past become the loudest voice in your future." Naomi looked back at him, her voice steady with quiet gratitude. "You were never just giving me a home. You were teaching me how to build one for someone else." A few weeks later, the old loading dock where Vincent had first met Naomi welcomed a different kind of visitor. The abandoned corner had been transformed into a neighborhood resource center offering meals, books, legal guidance, and educational support for children and families facing difficult seasons. Above the entrance, a simple bronze plaque carried no famous surname, no title, and no recognition of wealth. It displayed only one sentence: "Everyone deserves to have a name remembered." As children laughed inside the bright building and volunteers greeted each newcomer with kindness, Vincent quietly watched from across the street before turning away with a peaceful smile. At last, he understood that the strongest empire any person could ever leave behind was not built from money, influence, or fear. It was built from compassion that continued growing long after the person who planted it had walked away.